But maybe I could just take a few moments to start by painting a little bit of a wider picture. Energy today is going through an inordinate transition, not just within the European Union, but indeed on a global scale. You just have to think of the most obvious issues that have happened even in the last, say, 3 years. We've had, for example, if you look in the Far East, the Fukushima disaster some years ago, and the questions that that has raised with regard to nuclear. And I have to say also the implications in a practical sense that that has meant for the Japanese people with their practices for energy efficiency in a very real sense, because energy was in short supply. We have, of course, the shale gas revolution in the United States and the implications that that has both for the availability of gas and the knock-on consequences for the price of gas, but even perhaps more importantly, the price of coal, because now the United States doesn't really use its coal, rather they export it to other parts of the world, including Europe. Then, of course, you have the situation with the Ukraine and with Russia and the constant concern about the transit pipe for gas across the Ukraine and will it continue to flow, and the implications that that would have for so many of the member states who are almost 100% dependent on that gas. And then, of course, you have the geopolitics of price, where Saudi Arabia has now entered the scene and decided to let the price of oil drop to almost unimaginable levels, and the consequences of that for investment, for developments, and indeed for the shape of the energy system going forward. So I think it's fair to say that energy across the globe is going through quite a lot of changes, and we're not quite sure which way it's going to come out at the end of this and what are the various consequences of all of these changes. But what is absolutely certain, and this is something that we have seen again and again throughout our period in policy, is that in the end of the day, energy is local. And what we do on energy, its use or its efficiency, happens at the local level. And that's why today's event is so important, because it is on the ground that things happen, not just within the European Union, but indeed globally. And it is on the ground that we will be able to make the difference for the energy transition as it will impact on the economy in the European Union. And in that context, what we have done in the Commission 2 months ago, we came out with a new document, a new framework for our energy policy, the Energy Union. And in it, you will see that we have put into primary position two principles. The first is that the citizen must be at the centre. The citizen, the consumer, must be at the centre of the energy system. And secondly, energy efficiency first. And this is very novel. If you look back through the various papers that we have produced over the last years, consumers started to appear a few years ago, but up until that, consumers were a load factor. They weren't people. They were just a load factor. And energy efficiency was one of those things that was in the corner. You know, it sounded good, but that was all. And now these two principles have moved centre stage in our policies, as we have set out in the Energy Union. And it's a very hard-hatted approach to the policy, because the reason why we want consumers at the centre is because consumers make a difference and consumers make the market work, and we want a market to work because that's the most competitive and effective market we can have. And secondly, energy efficiency has already delivered. If you look at our paper of last July, you will see that for the first time in any region in the world, Europe has succeeded in decoupling GDP growth from energy consumption. And we showed that quite visibly last year. I'm very impressed to see that the Chinese are now saying that as well. Doesn't have quite the same meaning, but nonetheless it's a very positive thing that they are following is in that respect. And the reason why that is so important is not necessarily to persuade you, because I suspect I'm talking to an audience of people who are convinced, but to talk to audiences of people who perhaps either are unaware or who are not convinced of the value of this, and to talk to them in a way that they can relate to. And by this I mean ministries for finance, for example. because in the end of the day, it's the bottom line that persuades them. And by uncoupling energy consumption from GDP growth, we can show that this goes to the bottom line for Europe Inc. This means the economy is more competitive, and this means that consumers can handle the costs of energy more effectively. And this is one of the important messages that we take out of the analysis that we've done so far, and this is why we have put energy efficiency first, because that is the way we can be most effective, both from a cost perspective, but also from an economic perspective. In order to achieve this energy efficiency, of course, we have a number of tools and techniques in place. Yes. I'll try it, and if not, I'll give up. Firstly, within the European Union, we have quite a complex and, one might even say, relatively complete set of legislation in place. Some of it has been updated fairly recently, and our first objective has to be to implement the legislation as we have agreed, and to implement it fully. I can't put enough emphasis on that, because there's no point in bringing in legislation and then not applying it. And it's even worse to bring in legislation and apply it in some parts of Europe and not in others. So we really do want to have full implementation of the existing body of legislation, not just because it's our legislation we managed to get it adopted, but because it actually delivers on the ground. So our first priority is to make sure that the legislative framework that we currently have in place operates and remains effective. Within that, of course, we have a particular focus in terms of energy efficiency, and that is in looking at the building sector in Europe. Now, the building sector in Europe is characterized by the fact that we are a mature region. Our buildings are even more mature than we are. Indeed, one might say they are even old. Our new build is a very small share of our buildings. It's about 1%. So we will not be able to solve the problems or the energy efficiency problem of our buildings by relying on new builds. It's nice to have new builds. It's nice to have new zero energy buildings coming on stream, but at the rate of 1% every year, it's going to take an inordinately long time before that really has an impact. Our current retrofit rate at about 1.5%, depending on the member state, is not sufficiently fast. We need to speed up the rate of retrofit of our buildings in Europe. And that is going to cost us money. It's going to cost us about 100 billion euros a year, just to talk in round numbers, because it's always easier to remember a round number. And that's a lot of money. Now, from the perspective of the policymakers in Brussels, we are committed to that. And I think I can safely say that we have demonstrated our commitment insofar as we can with the limited public funds that are available to us. For example, the new structural funds, the European Structural and Investment Fund, will dedicate 38 billion euros to energy efficiency and renewable energy. And that's a very substantial increase for this programming round vis-à-vis the previous one. We have a concern that an awful lot of that money, almost 90% of it, is programmed today to be spent as grants. We would very strongly recommend that at least 25% of that funding would be spent through innovative financial instruments so that you get a revolving fund and you can continue to use the funding beyond the first time. So this is a challenge. We're working with the member states on that to try and get more value out of this increased budget in the structural funds. The second area, already mentioned by Didier, is the Juncker package, the European Fund for Strategic Investments, going through the mixing bowl of both Council and Parliament at the moment, likely to be finalised next month perhaps, or even in June, and designed to deliver more than 300 billion euros into the European economy over the next 3 years. This is a very serious amount of money. This is money in the capital markets. This is not grants. This is not ring-fenced money, although, as you probably are aware, the European Parliament did wish to see some of the money ring-fenced specifically for energy efficiency. So it's not ring-fenced. It's not ring-fenced neither for themes nor for geographic localities. So it's pretty much a first-come, first-served basis for access to the fund, and Ralph will go through that in greater detail. And a third area where the funding has been most successful is in the project development assistance facilities. ELENA, the EASMA PDA, MLEI, where over the last period of years, approximately 100 million has supported 95 projects and realised 4.8 billion euros of investment. But that's all about money and money supply. And one of the messages that we get constantly when we talk to the financial people is that there really isn't a shortage of money per se. We've had a group with financial investors, the FA group. They've done a very detailed analysis. They've done a report, and the report is available online. And they have identified what for them are the problems in terms of getting the money into the system. It's like you have a big pot of money over here, you have a big demand over here, and what are the bridges, what are the connections that we can make between the two? So in that context, I think it's very important to have a look at their report. It's relevant for you, it's relevant obviously for us, and we are continuing to work on their recommendations in order to deliver in that context. But perhaps the one area where really we have a question mark still, and I would welcome this workshop, having a discussion on it and maybe pooling your ideas, and that is to better understand what are the behavioural drivers for people to become involved in energy efficiency on the ground. What are the motivators that makes you or your neighbour or your mother or your brother and your sister actually firstly think about what is my energy consumption, what's it costing me? Secondly, can I do something about it? And then what happens after that? What are the behavioural factors that we need to understand and maybe build on in order to really mobilise citizens in the European Union in this direction? We can set a policy framework here in Brussels, but if it doesn't manifest itself on the ground across all of the communities, all of the localities in Europe, it will deliver nothing. So the question I suppose I'm asking you today is, what is it that we need to do, working with you, to maximise the tools and the impact of those tools in order to mobilise citizens on the ground in localities to become aware and to become active in the area of energy efficiency? And I think if we can do that, we can achieve wondrous things in the European Union to our benefit and to the benefit of the European economy. Thank you very much.